So we're almost done with this module, but one very cool feature is missing, and that is custom hooks. You can build your own hooks. You're not restricted to the built-in ones. So let's do that. I'll add a new hooks folder where I want to store my hooks, and there I'll add one custom hook, and that's my HTTP hook. Because I have that HTTP functionality in Ingredients.js, for example, where I send HTTP requests. I do this multiple times, and the pattern always is the same. Dispatch send at the beginning, dispatch response once the response is there, dispatch error if we have an error. It's always the same pattern. So we have logic that we want to share across components, but, and that's the important thing, logic which also influences the state of the components where we want to use that logic. So we can't use a normal function, because of course we could build our normal send request function, which simply has all that send request logic in there. But from in a normal function, we couldn't dispatch events which then change the state in a component that calls the function. That's something only hooks can do. And that's why we build our own hook now. So in the HTTP.js file, in the hooks folder, I want to build my own hook. And the first very important thing there is your own hooks should always be named use something. In my case here, use HTTP or use fetch or whatever you want to name it, but use something written like this. And I'll go with use HTTP. Then your hook is just a function. It's a normal JavaScript function, just treated in a special way by React. That's the core thing. So now we have this, and I will export use HTTP here. So that's a very simple hook, which doesn't do anything, but it's a start. The cool thing is, in this hook, you can now use stateful features. You can use state, use effect, use reducer, anything. You can use any hook in there. And any component that uses your own hook will then run this hook as if you had the code written in here directly in the component. So it's not like you have one function shared by multiple components and then they run the same code with the same data. No, each functional component gets its own snapshot of this hook, so to say. So that's a cool thing. You can have stateful logic in there, but the stateful logic will then be different for each component where you use that hook, so that you can share the logic, not the data. That's the idea behind hooks. So what do we want to have in this custom hook? Well, I'd say it makes sense to move our HTTP reducer into there. So let's go to Ingredients.js and fetch this HTTP reducer, cut it from there, and let me close the UI folder, move it here into HTTP.js. And I'll define it outside of the hook, because again, this doesn't need to rerun with every re-render cycle, and your hook will rerun with every re-render cycle. That's important. Your hook will get called whenever the component where you're using your hook gets re-executed. And then you can use techniques in your hook, of course, to make sure that nothing happens to the state or that something does happen, depending on what you want. But in general, it will get re-executed. I don't want to recreate the reducer all of the time, so I'll move that out of there, just as we did it for the component. Now, of course, since the reducer function was removed, I'll also remove the use reducer call from Ingredients.js and move it into HTTP.js, now inside of my custom hook, here. Now to use reuse reducer, we have to import it. So let's import use reducer from React. We don't need to import React itself here because we're not building a React component here. We just want to use some features from the React package, in this case, use reducer. So here I then have my state and dispatch HTTP, which right now isn't that useful, but we'll get there. Now the request itself. Let's go to Ingredients.js and let's grab one of these requests. Let's grab the one where we handle the error here in remove ingredient. I'll take this entire fetch block with all the then and catch blocks thereafter, cut it, and add it to HTTP.js. This would now execute this HTTP request whenever the component that uses useHTTP reruns. And that's certainly not what we want here. We don't want to run this all the time. Instead, I'll create a new function here in my use HTTP hook, which I'll name send request. Name is up to you though. And that is a function which should actually send the request, so that it's not always getting sent when use HTTP is called, but only when send request is called, which right now never happens, but we'll do that soon. Now, send request, of course, needs to be a bit more flexible because we don't always want to send the request to this URL here. So the URL should probably be something we get from outside. The same for the method and the body of the request. So here I'll remove the URL and use the URL argument instead. And for method, I'll use method. And we might have a body, which is the body we're getting. And because it doesn't hurt here, I'll always add the header content type application JSON. For a GET request, we don't need it, but it won't hurt. And for some requests, like POST requests, we need it. So I will always append it. Now we have a flexible HTTP request, a fetch call, which depends on data we get from outside, which will go ahead and then dispatch our response. And at the beginning, also dispatch an action of type send. So that's the statefulness I was talking about. We're interacting with our reducer here because this custom hook will in the end be used in a component which then will automatically get all that state, so to say, or where this state will be connected to by React automatically. So here we send, here we get the response. Now, of course, what we do with the response, however, in this case that we delete the ingredient, that doesn't belong to this hook. That's something the component that uses our hook needs to do. The hook should be just caring about the HTTP request, not about what we do with the response. So we'll have to see how we manage that. For the error, I dispatch this error request. But how can we now get the response data back to, well, the component that uses our own request? Well, we can add something new to our HTTP state here. Let's start with the initial state. Besides loading an error, we can have some data in there, which initially is null. But if we get a response, besides setting loading to false, I set data equal to action.response data, for example, a key I'm expecting on the action. When we send a request, I'll reset data to null here, so that this is definitely null once we send a new request. So I get response data if we have a response. So here, when we have a response, I'll actually cut this and return response JSON, which extracts us the response body. And then the next block, I got my response data extracted. And in here, I dispatch the response action. But now we edited this action, or this case here, to also extract response data from the action. So we'll set a response data key on the action we're dispatching and save my response data we're getting here, thanks to response JSON, in there so that it's now part of the action. So now the important thing is the data we're getting for the request we're sending is stored in our state here. That's all nice, but still, it's in the hook. How do we now connect this to our component? Well, just like some of the built-in hooks, our own hook can, of course, return something. So here at the end of the hook, I will return an array, but you don't have to return an array. You can also return an object here or a single number, whatever your hook needs. Here I'll go with an array, or actually I'll go with an object to show that you can return different things than just arrays. And in that object, I'll return my isLoading key, and that is coming from HTTP state, which is what useReducer returns me here, which I'm extracting here, which will have a loading property, an error property, and a data property. So here it's HTTP state loading. Then we have data, which is HTTP state data, and we have an error, which is HTTP state error. So this is what my hook now returns. And now we can use that hook. In ingredients.js, there, let's import use HTTP. And here you also have to, you can name it whatever you want, but it has to start with use from hooks HTTP, like that. So now I want to use HTTP, and just as all other hooks, you have to use it on the root level. So we can't use it in here in the remove ingredient handler. That won't work. Instead, we have to call use HTTP somewhere here, like that. But that's okay, because use HTTP doesn't send the request actually. It just sets up the logic for sending a request. It sets up our state, and it sets up this function which sends a request. So we should probably return that function too. So in this object I'm returning, I'm also returning send request and I point at this send request function. So now we return a handle to this function as well. Now to avoid unnecessary re-renders, I'll already also import use callback here and wrap send request with use callback like this, and add an empty array as a second argument because this doesn't have any external dependencies. So it's good like that. So send request is returned and it will not re-render unnecessarily, which helps us optimize rebuilds. And now in ingredients.js, use HTTP therefore returns our HTTP object, whatever you want to call it. In the end, that's our object where we can use destructuring to pull out is loading, a potential error we're getting, the data we're getting, and send request. These are the four things, the four properties we're returning in our hook. These four properties. And with object destructuring, which I'm using here, I'm pulling them out and storing them in separate constants. Now we can use these constants. So for the moment, I'll comment all of that logic here out. We'll fix that later. And here, where we use HTTP state error in our JSX code, I just use error because that's one of the things I pulled out of my result from use state. And for loading, well, it's just is loading, another thing I'm pulling out from there. Now, when we're deleting an ingredient here, I therefore in the end just use send request to send a request to a URL. And that should be, of course, the URL of an ingredient. So it's this URL. So let's use backticks here actually so that we can inject values. Then it's /ingredients at the end. Then, just as before, the ingredient ID and then .json. That's the URL. Then the method is delete. That's the second argument send request expects. And we need no body, so we can omit the third argument. Now, send request is now a dependency of use callback because send request is actually a thing we're returning here from use HTTP. And if we would not wrap send request with use callback inside of use HTTP, this would actually change whenever the component where we use HTTP, so whenever ingredients re-renders, and therefore send request would change on every re-render there, and therefore a remove ingredient handler would change, and we would again lose all our optimizations. Since we use callback in our custom hook, we ensure that send request never changes, and we can safely add it as a dependency here. It will not change, and therefore this will not recreate this function unnecessarily, and hence our optimizations stay intact. So now we're sending this request here when we're clicking remove ingredient handler. Let's give it a try. Let's go here, log in, and click this. And you saw the loading state, that's great. Something changed. The ingredient is still there though, but interestingly enough, on Firebase it's indeed gone. Now that makes sense because we sent the request and it's good that it worked, but we're not updating our ingredients here. That's of course the next thing we'll have to do. We're not done entirely. We have our hook for managing HTTP requests, but for updating our data in this ingredients component, we have no solution yet.